Hey, all my IFG friends, this is Steve. I want to say, if you like movies like I do, we've started a new podcast called Happy Hour Flicks. You can find it anywhere podcasts are found. It's all about nostalgic movies that we love, and we bring on special guests each episode, and we also have specialty cocktails made for each one, too. So it really is an hour of a good time talking about movies that we love, like Gremlins, Seven, Free Willy. We talk about The Last Starfighter also. I mean, we kind of run the gamut across all the decades and really have a great time. So wanted to invite you to come over and join us. That's Happy Hour Flicks, anywhere podcasts are found.
This is the
Independent
Filmmaker's Guide
from Framework Productions.
Framework
Productions.
Welcome back to another episode of the Independent Filmmaker's Guide. I am Stephen Pierce, your host, and with me always is Matt Mundy here. Matt, how you doing?
I'm doing quite well, man. How are you today, Steve?
I'm enjoying that the weather is it's not the apocalypse. It's no longer Blade Runner 2049 outside, and that is, that's quite pleasant, I think. Joining us today also with their new series, or at least series pilot. We're going to get into that. That's one of my first questions. We have Luke and Keith from The Fourth Wall, who are making their premiere here in Tribeca. Guys, thanks very much for taking the time to join us.
Great to be here.
Thanks so much for having us.
You guys are also New York-based people, so, I mean, before we get into the project, I mean, how did you guys feel about all the craziness that was, whenever New York was converted into basically a post-apocalyptic setting here over the last week?
Well, I missed a bunch of it. I didn't get to town till yesterday, and so.
Oh, good for you, man.
Oh, lucky, yeah. Luke, so you're based in L.A., Luke?
No, I'm between New York and Massachusetts.
Oh, New York, Massachusetts. Oh, yeah. So you still got it a little bit up there in Massachusetts.
For sure.
It was just absolute, complete craziness. So, I mean, it was...
Keith, were you stuck outside for any of that?
I was actually had to be in Midtown, and I mean, it was scary. It actually reminded me of the early days of COVID, everybody panicking, putting their mask back on, not knowing what to do. So, yeah, it was scary.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I felt good because I had a mask and I kind of knew what to do. I was like, oh, these are not just, taking up a room in my apartment for no reason at all anymore.
Totally.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about your guys. The first thing I have to do is The Fourth Wall, which you guys are premiering at Tribeca, correct?
Correct. Yep, tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
That's right.
Wow, very, very exciting.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's great.
Is this a pilot episode, or do you guys have a full series that you are currently working on?
This is the first episode of 4, but we have the full series.
Oh, so you've shot and completed the full series, or at least are in the process of completing it?
Yeah, near completed, but the whole story is shot and basically edited too. It's all laid out, and in some ways we would be ready to show the whole thing at this point. We feel like we've got what we have the story all together, but that would be a long time to sit in a theater at a film festival showing the first episode.
Awesome. Well, so with that in mind, and either of you can take this, I would say for our listeners, just as how you would like to describe it, either the whole series itself or what you're premiering at Tribeca, how you would best describe what your work is, what The Fourth Wall is.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think we can talk about the whole series, really. It covers the history of the Sullivanian group, which was originally the Sullivan Institute for Psychoanalytic Research, and over time became a communal living kind of insulated community, meeting a lot of the criteria of a cult. Along the way, they had a theater company in which participation was mandatory, and that theater company was called The Fourth Wall, which is where we get the title from. But so that's the historical side of it. But Keith, you want to talk about the more personal side of the story too?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what makes it, I think it separates what we're doing from some of the other sort of cult docs and cult docuseries that are out there, is the combination of this historical narrative that we're telling about the history of this group, which actually spanned decades. It's the institute that Luke was talking about was founded in the 50s, and the group was in its heyday through the 70s and 80s, and then it sort of fell apart in the early 90s. So, there's this, sort of fascinating history that spans all these years. But then at the same time, what happened when Luke and I started to investigate this history together, which was about 10 years ago, we started this project, is we discovered very quickly that the story wasn't really over. We thought we were just sort of, going to tell this historical narrative, but we realized that for so many people that we were talking to, the processing of it, the grappling with their trauma, their guilt, all the years they'd sort of spent in hiding from it after it fell apart, all these things were like still present for everybody. And even in their current relationships with spouses or family or friends, with their children, some of them they hadn't even told about their past. So all these things, sort of we realized that we had this actually contemporary present tense storyline that we have to follow this as well. And that's where the idea for a series came, as opposed to just a feature length doc, was that there was just this incredible, sort of multi-dimensional narrative going on with this interplay between the past and the present, constantly speaking to each other. So where my story fits into all that is that I grew up inside the group. My parents were the leaders of it. And, I went through that process with a lot of the members of when the group fell apart in 1991, 92. I sort of, I left New York. A lot of people stayed in the tri-state area, but, we sort of all went into hiding, really. Because there had been this publicity in the late 80s around some custody cases where people had taken their children out of the group or they had left the group and then were trying to take their children out as well. And it led to this sort of explosive, sort of media moment about the group, this sort of scandalous publicity. And there's a little bit of that in this first pilot episode that you saw. But we get into that in much more detail later on in the series. So it's one of, it's sort of one of the most dramatic turns in the story. And so, everybody was just scarred by this publicity and wanted nothing to do with it. It was sort of like the group had been publicly shamed and everybody wanted to, kind of get as far away from the stories they possibly could and rebuild their lives. And that included my own family, which was my mother and my father, who was Saul Newton, the leader of the group, died in 1991, which is, a big part of the reason why the whole thing fell apart. She remarried another member from the group and then sort of rebuilt this, conventional looking life in the Westchester suburbs, and so we spent, the next 20 years sort of living like a semi-normal family, but with this giant looming shadow of the past hanging over us that nobody was really willing to talk about or to confront in any way. So, I knew firsthand, how the secrecy about it and the shame of it, would once you've internalized those things, you just can't tell the difference between, what was real and what was not real and what was, what were all these things around you. And especially because I was a kid during the group, there was so much that was kept from me and so much I didn't understand. So I knew the basic constructs of this community we lived in. We certainly didn't call it a cult at that time. It was only when I was a teenager that I first heard the word cult used to talk about us. And I was like, oh, really? Is that what we are? That doesn't seem right, but maybe, it's like you don't understand these things, in real time, especially because I was being coached on how to talk about it, how to think about it. I had been indoctrinated in many ways, even though we were living in the heart of New York City. I was going to normal school outside of our home, and had friends outside of the group. So there was this bifurcated, reality that I was always living in. But what I did internalize was that you don't want to talk about this thing that we're living inside of, which involved communal living, children not being raised by their own parents, children not even knowing who their own parents are, all of the adult members sleeping with different partners every single night. no real marriages or families. Everybody in therapy, with one of what were known as the lead therapists, which were at the top of it, were my parents. And so there was all these things that we knew we knew the basic framework for what this structure was, but even as an adult, before Luke and I began this project, I still the whole context for any of that stuff was still a total mystery for me. Like, why did people stay in this thing so long? Why did they let their therapist tell them who to sleep with, who to live with, who to have families with, what jobs to have, to break off their contact with their own families, parents and siblings outside the group, to be involved in this radical political theater? Why did anybody allow themselves to do that or be convinced to do that for so many years? What was really taking place inside therapy? Like, all these things I just didn't have any answers for, and nobody to give me the answers, because, when everybody sort of splintered after the group broke up, there was nobody to talk to other than my mother, who wouldn't tell me anything.
Right.
In a straight way, which is, sort of the core, of the series in a lot of ways. And that the relationship between me and my mom evolves over the course of the 4 episodes, as I try to disentangle the truth from, the story that she always gave and actually hangs on to, in ways till the bitter end.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like this is a direct, it's a very direct, very personal sort of attachment, obviously, you have to the story. We've only seen episode 1, and I don't want to give anything away, and I obviously don't know about the series, and I don't think you want to give anything away about the overall series, but it is a sort of a very interesting sort of active look inside of something that I would classify, for just what I've seen, as a very cult sort of lifestyle. And it's a unique view to see people speaking about something that is not in such a distant past, and it does still affect them, in the moment. And I can only imagine that for you, this is a very intense piece of work, and it was a very hard decision to figure out how to approach it and how to start cracking this nut. So how did you guys, knowing that everything you were going to do was going to affect you personally, how did you initially step in on this? Like, what was the first steps of being like, okay, we're going to actually explore this?
Mm-hmm. Well, like Keith was mentioning a moment ago, that this began as sort of just a look at the history of this group, without the side of the story that involves Keith so personally. And that's how we began the whole process, was by just trying to reach out to people. Keith mentioned how the publicity that covered the group sort of towards the end of its lifespan as a group was so jarring and traumatic for so many people. The idea of talking about it again, especially on camera, was really, really hard for people to swallow at first. And so there was a lot of trust building, and it took a lot of time actually to get the initial stages of this project going, to express to people what our goals were, and that this was a safe place to kind of entrust telling the story. So we began with that, and then it wasn't until later when we realized so much of the story was pointing back to Keith's, basically his research process that was going into making the documentary, and not just, a sort of a detective or journalistic process, although that was part of it, but also one that fully it enveloped him as his personal life, and his family, and his whole process of discovery. Again, not just like for the information, but for what his childhood was. And so that shift was a gradual one. Your question was like, what did it, how did we step into this? And it was really just a gradual step-by-step process of realizing that was a big part of the story. We kind of couldn't tell this without including.
And yeah, for me as well, to jump off from that too, it's a great question. And it's hard to give, like, I want to be able to say to other people, this is how you would approach something this personally. But the truth is, it was a very, very long process for me, even to get to the place where I was ready to do this. I'd been a writer, mostly writing poetry, and I think that felt like a safe place to explore my experience because it's so coded, and so cryptic. So that for years, that's how I think I was, even without totally being aware of it, was sort of exploring the past through this sort of through a medium that also had a lot of mystery and secrecy around it. And it really was starting to work with Luke, that really was the turning point for me. I mean, I realized that a documentary was the absolute right form for this story, because in wanting to investigate the past, I knew I needed to go back and talk to the people who were in the group, and that to do it in any other form, like that everybody's stories were going to be so specific to them, and that already I was dealing with these multiple realities, and the division between how I thought of my own experience and how my mother talked about it. And I knew that this was something that needed to be documented in people's own words, that it was such a collective story that needed to be told in their individual voices. But so I knew it needed to be a documentary, but it wasn't until I met Luke and we started working together on this that we had actually been acquaintances, but we didn't know each other that well, and we had certainly never talked about any of this stuff before I pitched it to him and some of his producing partners at SeaThink. And he immediately sparked all of his interest, and he had actually, I mean, he can speak to this better than I can, but he was, what was so amazing and heartening about it was that he was immediately, his reaction was like, I've been looking to explore a subject like this and didn't quite know what to attach myself to, but I knew he knew that there was a subject matter that he was wanted to investigate himself. And I had sort of the opposite thing, which was I knew what the subject was, but I didn't quite know how to investigate it. I didn't quite know how to approach it. So having the support from Luke and he's such an incredible, intelligent, experienced, thoughtful, sensitive filmmaker. So I couldn't imagine having done this, if we hadn't found each other and, built this partnership. And it's actually the trust between us is really the heart of what, allowed other people to trust that this project would be something they could, invest themselves in, come out of hiding for, feel like they could tell their own stories in a way that would be, respected and woven together into a larger narrative that, they could feel good about.
Yeah, and that actually brings me to a very specific point for either of you to take, but it sounds like, Luke, you might want to jump in here with this, since, our listeners are filmmakers also, with having, because I know, Keith, you obviously probably had at least at front ideas of people you wanted to talk to, whether at first or just like down the line, you had a list or an idea. And then Luke, whether that was you or with SeaThink, knowing that, okay, well, if we're going to be telling a story here, there's clearance issues, there's some legal things we have to get through. Was there kind of a let's go out and get them and then figure it out? Was there let's get these clearances and then go, or was it case by case? A lot of that documentary when you're telling a story, and especially stories that have already been that are out there, but you're obviously telling your from this particular point of view and kind of bringing forth all these amazing layers. And I just kind of want to talk about that clearance issue for a lot of our filmmaker listeners.
Do you mean when you say clearance, like permission to include people in the story? Yeah. So at the beginning of the process, the square one of everything really started with Keith being someone who had lived in the community that we were looking at, and so him being able to have personal connections that he could reach out to people and say, this is a project I'm working on, this is the approach we're taking, and we would love to speak to you. We really at the beginning, and we carried this through, but one of the initial ideas was this is a group with hundreds of people in it over the course of its lifetime as a group, and we wanted to kind of bring in as much of that choir of voices.
Right, you wanted to get the decades of voices there.
Decades, and also just the sense that like it's a shared experience, and a shared experience is best expressed by a lot of different perspectives. And so trying to get a lot of different voices. I mean, we interviewed and filmed with, I'd say, like well over 40 people for this, and from different time periods and different relationships to the group. But so, yeah, we started with that being the beginning of outreach, very personal connections. And even with those, like I was saying, trust is a huge issue in a story like this. And so making sure people felt like they were knowing what we were doing and weren't going to get screwed over by this in some way or another. And so that's where it began. Later on,
did you have legal set up ahead of time then for that, or where did that come in to make sure? Because obviously you're building the trust, and Keith, you're in the middle of that, and that's kind of what I think, Keith, you were talking about with Luke coming in. So just either of you to pick up on that. So was did you go in with get the legal help first to make sure, or did you just kind of go in with the trust of like, I'm in the middle of this, or Keith, you're in the middle of this?
We went in with like the baseline legal work in place for it. I mean, mainly just like depiction releases and assurances about what we were doing. And there wasn't the need to do too much more legal work at that point, really. I mean, we were building basically a proof of concept for the first year or so of doing this. So that's where we got to begin all that from. Later the story, as we researched more and included more in the story, there's people that we filmed with who we contacted outside of Keith's personal connections, or second degree, third degree connections that started with Keith, those were people who were brought into the story, each in their like case by, like you're saying, case by case.
Right.
So I have a little bit of a story or a question as you guys are developing the piece together in the series. How did you all approach the edits? Like, because a lot of documentary is made when you're making the edit. I mean, almost all of it is because you kind of get what you get, and then you sit down and you start filing it and assigning and building your story. So I'm sure there was a concern about, because Keith, you end up being kind of the face of this series. Luke, whenever you'd approach him with an edit, were you guys working together on it, or were you showing him kind of a final project? And was there any consideration about that? And, on both sides of the camera, like, as you're developing the thing, Luke, and Keith, as you're having to see it?
Well, there was a lot of communication between us, but like really the whole way through this thing, including when we were filming before we started editing. We continued to film once the edit was open for a while, so we had kind of things happening at the same time. But just there's a lot of dialogue about like what ideas I was trying to work in from various production approaches and things like that, so that Keith had a sense of where it was headed even before edit began. But this was all told like a 10-year project, and so we had a lot of time to develop not just the research end of the story, but the storytelling end of the story too. And so Keith and I worked out many outlines, like over and over and over again, especially when we expanded it from a feature to a series, figuring out how those beats were going to work and how to break them up in episodes and things like that. So Keith had a very clear idea about what the story was how it was going to be told, what was going to be included, and stuff like that. When the edit itself started, we worked with these two great editors, Leah Boatwright and Connor Kalista, they worked on the whole series. Keith didn't sit in on as much of the edit as I did, but he was brought up to speed on like basically every iteration of the cut, and was just able to kind of keep tabs on how it was developing from one iteration to the next. So there wasn't really that it wasn't that sort of thing where we worked on it without him for a while and then put it in front of him for sort of approval. He was really involved in it the whole way.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching, scenes and/or versions of episodes almost every day when we were deep into the edit, and the edit was, like Luke's saying, was built off an outline that the two of us wrote over a period of time, and we had been shooting at that point for a few years, and we had a sense of where what material we had, and obviously the historical narrative was a little more clear. We kind of knew what had happened in the past, so that was a bit easier to plot out across multiple episodes, whereas the contemporary storyline were a little more complex and a little more fluid, and we could have gone a lot of different ways. We shot with a lot of different people in their contemporary lives, and we we had to decide based on what we had shot which stories we were going to focus on and then keep filming with. So I mean, yeah, so both of us, I mean, everything we shot, we always was always a dialogue between the two of us. What are we going to focus on? Who are we shooting with? What are we trying to get out of this shoot? Once the story was mostly established, we started shooting specifically for to fill out certain storylines. Yeah. So it's a little hard to talk about without seeing all 4 episodes, but there's we start whittling down. The first episode, the pilot, is incredibly important in setting up the story, and it sets into motion certain storylines.
But it's just it feels like a context where you guys were just really getting started at the end, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And the later episodes get more deeply into the present day storylines, so that sort of builds over the course of the series.
Right, and it's a very exciting kind of story structure to work with, because we had this historical. There's like basically an A and B narrative, although the contemporary narrative is really several of them, and we knew what the historical one was, so we could plot that out very easily, or at least very straightforwardly. And then as we were editing, or first outlining and then writing and then editing, we were still filming the contemporary stuff, so we would think we have a certain trajectory of a storyline in place, and something would change, and we'd have to figure out how that worked in with the interplay with the past and everything like that. And it's sometimes some moments it's a challenge, but it's like a really invigorating way to tell a story where it's live and responsive basically as you're telling it.
I mean, this is also kind of late to the game here. We should have done this probably much earlier in the episode, but what is generally the elevator pitch for this? Like, whenever you're telling somebody, like, hey, this is what the story is about, how do you sum that up in just a couple sentences?
Well, it's a story about a forgotten New York City psychotherapy cult that is most notable to people when they engage with it, that they look like everybody else. They're not a group that seems like so far off and wearing different clothes and living in the desert or the woods or something like that, but they're right in New York City. They look like a lot of people and yet all this is going on underneath. And so really kind of the purpose of, or not the purpose, but the one of the appeals of this story is a way to look at a cult and not see it so far away from your own self.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it makes sense. So thank you. Yeah, and kind of what we've been, I'll dovetail back a little bit with how the stories unfolded. And you're talking about with the historical, which, Luke, you were saying a little bit more straightforward, just kind of more chronological, if you will, in some cases. And then the narrative or contemporary part, which has, led to some of those editorial decisions of the mixture of reenactment and archival footage. And I just wanted to ask about your process on those decisions, and how you came about that, and specifically with the reenactments themselves, but also just how the decision with both of those.
Sure. Well, so the archival material that is from the group and individuals in the group it's a huge part of the story. It was a very central and intensive part of this whole process. It was the discovery of various tranches of that, of like audio tapes, footage that we sourced from Russia, that they sent a news crew over to cover them at one point that no one knew existed until we were deep in the research with this. Things like that all just sort of like, there were various building blocks that added to our ability to tell the story in a firsthand way. But then there were also various things that were really important parts of the story that we couldn't get firsthand coverage of in any way. Like the plays themselves, which again, everyone in the group was involved in the plays, whether they were acting in them or making costumes or doing lights or whatever. They were involved in the theater production company.
Exactly.
That's such an important part of the story. And we always knew, since we got our hands on the first scripts for those, how much the plays became this sort of lens of, or not lens, but this interpretive way that the group was kind of expressing its ideology out to the outside world. So, and it was done in a way where it wasn't very self-critical. So it was like, we believe that we are living in this way that is the right way to live, and so we're going to put that into a play that shows that that dogma, basically. So we really wanted to get those in there somehow, the actual content of the plays, not just like the visual, like not just, we had a bunch of publicity photos and things like that. But we wanted
and Keith, I think your mom showed a couple posters, not giving anything away, no spoilers here.
But wait, just to jump in for one sec, just to be clear, the play restagings that we're talking about, those are the only reenactments we do. We specifically did not want any other reenactments, even though there are things that we would love to have coverage of, like therapy sessions or things like that are, were very hard to, get any actual, footage of. We didn't, exactly. So we didn't reenact anything other than those plays, and the plays felt like the perfect ground because they're plays. They're meant to be, staged. So that felt appropriate. But it was from the beginning, Luke and I's agreement that we weren't going to use reenactments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then within the plays, it's just an opportunity to like give some of those lines from these scripts that we had some life, to show the intensity of someone performing it, and to start thinking about what the group was trying to say with those plays. And to be clear, like, not the writing of the plays was a few people in the group. It wasn't like a fully collective thing that was written, but like they were, for the people who did write them and direct them, they were done in a way to express the ideologies of the group in sort of a sublimated way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially because the theater itself had presented it had become the central voice after, all these other things, that it became a central voice to kind of distill all the therapy and the things that were happening in the community, it seemed. So
it's such an interesting fact of that, I will say, is because it is, you don't imagine, a group like this that is so into therapy and kind of cross, socialization and things like this, then all of a sudden turning around and putting on, Hello Dolly, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, it feels like a little out of left field in the study. And it was a very interesting part of the documentary. For me, that's one of the things that immediately like hooked me. And I was like, wait a second, hold on. And I had to rewind it and be like, that they did what? Is it, it's just sort of interesting.
Totally. No, it is. No, it's totally fascinating, and it was not easy to, it's not that's one of the harder parts to explain to people, and that's why it's so important to have the visual storytelling aspects of it to get across what it actually was. And it's also what's, so it's so central to how it became a cult too. Without the theater, people's it would have been harder to restrict and control people's lives as much as they did. Obviously the actual manipulation and coercion was happening through therapy, but it was also happening through the community, through, peer pressure and, the reinforcement by all the members of the group of what they were hearing in therapy and what the directives were coming down from the leadership through therapy. But the theater gave this, sort of control structure, this real hierarchy to the group. And it sort of allowed the leaders, who were also the heads of the directors of the theater, to say, well, you have to be doing this, you have to be doing that, you're not pulling your weight here. And in therapy, they would excoriate people for, their failures having to do with the theater, as though there were personal failures. Instead, right. So without that, the mechanisms of control would have been a lot weaker over time. I think the theater allowed it to really coalesce as a cult, and it also it kind of weeded out. There's like a saying about cults. There's I think it was Synanon, but it's a famous thing of you're driving a bus and all these people are hanging off the sides, and you swerve really hard, and some people fall off, but the ones who stay on or hold on even tighter. And that's sort of what the theater did. Some people were like, I'm not gonna do this what? I'm not an actress, I'm not gonna do this, I'm not gonna spend all my time doing this. But everybody who stayed got in that much deeper.
Yeah. And speaking of staying and the playing, just makes me think of, and of course we're on a filmmaking podcast, there is a filmmaker in your film that was a member, and you have a few segments with him. And and for our audiences, I don't want to spoil anything if you don't want to, but I do want to. What's that?
Go ahead.
All right, go ahead. We're talking about Wes Craven, and at least I am. And I know I just did a little math in my head when I was watching, and I was like, wait, he wrote Last House on the Left, and I think Hills Have Eyes while he was still a member. And just wanted, and or was that like right after he had left? Right.
He had just made Last House on the Left before he joined.
Got it. And so it was Hills Have Eyes.
Yeah.
So yeah, and you don't have to spend too much time on it because this story is so much bigger than that, but it's definitely interesting. And I wanted to ask about just setting up that interview if you wanted to.
Yeah, that was a real chance encounter, actually, where one of our cinematographers was at the same place as him and was talking about this project he was working on, and Wes knew exactly what it was, but just by the description, and talked about how he had been in it. And this interview was we conducted it just about a year before he died, but it was the first time he spoke publicly about this ever. And I mean, just what I learned from talking to him about it was that it held this place for him. The experience of control and the experience of people saying they're offering you freedom, but they're actually controlling you and trying to limit your freedom as much as possible. All various elements about like how sex was used in the cult and things like that are all things that really stuck with him for the rest of his life. And once you know all that, you can kind of see it in his work from there on out too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you guys have been working on this project for quite some time. When did you start really filming? When did this become not an idea and a practical execution?
We started filming the first interviews in 2013.
Wow. So 10 years. It has been 10 years in the making.
Yes.
Yeah. And again, it's something that, will come out much more when the full series is released. But that length of time and what happens over time and how things change and how relationships change and how people's sense of the past changes, all of that we could only capture because of the length of time. Obviously, when we started, we didn't set out for it to go on this long. We thought we would, be wrapped up, in a much shorter amount of time. But, the silver lining was how much we were able to capture, and just the largeness of the canvas ultimately, because of the length of the process. So that actually, when we set out, we always knew there was that the question of memory and this interplay between past and present was central, but we weren't really thinking that actually we would capture some of those same dynamics over time as we filmed. But that's really what happened. So the ways things change over time becomes central to the series as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And now you're having this amazing kind of culmination of your journey here with premiere at Tribeca, which is obviously one of the big film festivals. And I imagine you got to feel great about that, and you have to feel really good about where you're going next. Do you have any plans or any idea about where the series is going to ultimately live?
We don't know exactly yet, because there's interest around it, but we don't know exactly where it's going to show up next. Right now, we're really focused on this premiere this weekend, because not only is Tribeca a great place to show it for the reasons you said, but this is such a New York story. There's going to be a lot of people whose lives were touched by the story who are able to come see it this weekend. And so the event of this premiere weekend is going to be its own amazing thing. So we're kind of focused on that moment. And looking forward to when we can show everyone the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you said it. I mean, I think Tribeca is a great home for this because it is a New York story, and that feels like such a class or such a elegant way to, wrap this up, or have a premiere at least. We can move on to its next chapter. So for people, when it is going to premiere somewhere, and for you both, how do people find you and learn more about the project and you two individuals as well?
One of the best ways to find out about the latest on this would be through See-Think Films website or social media stuff. Any announcements about it, we would be posting through there.
And for our listeners, that's SEETHINK Films.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And I want to also thank our collaborators on this too. We made this with Submarine Deluxe and the Kennedy Marshall Company too. So they've been really, really good collaborators as we developed this into a series and made it into the thing it is today.
That's awesome. That's so great. I mean, and Keith, for you as well, same?
See-Think is the way to find out everything about this project, and hopefully when it comes out in the world, you won't be able to escape it. So you won't have to look very far. I
was gonna say, using the word "can't escape it," ladies and gentlemen, we have come full circle. That's great, and just on behalf of me and Steve and our listeners, thank you, Keith. Thank you, Luke, for sharing a little bit about the nuts and bolts and the passion and the person behind Fourth Wall. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Filmmaking is a collaborative experience, and so is this podcast. So be sure to follow us on Instagram at framework_productions and subscribe to Independent Filmmakers Guide wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a rating and a review so we can keep making the show better. Plus, it is really helpful and part of the collaboration. And if you'd like to read the credits for an episode, call us at 347-871-1559 and leave us your email. IFG, How Movies Get Made.
Hey friends, we just wanted to take a quick moment to talk about two personal things. First, we wanted to thank you, our listening community, and our wonderful guests, learning so much together along the way and continuing to learn, sharing our stories, making a lot of new friends, and collaborating, which is exactly what this is all about. Which also brings me to my second point. In great part to many of these new relationships, we wanted to let you know that we've taken a lot of this advice ourselves and made our own narrative feature film, Herd, H-E-R-D, Herd, which is premiering this October on Friday the 13th in select theaters as well as on VOD. Personally, I think it's the perfect kind of scary movie to watch during our favorite scary season. So we'd love for you to celebrate with us and watch Herd. You can pre-order it on Apple TV, and of course, do the communal thing, see it in theaters. Of course, for all of this, please see our show notes, but basically, we're going to keep it all updated at herd.film. That's HERD.FILM, herd.film as well. Thank you again, and be sure to give us a rating and a review over on Apple Podcasts so we can continue to build this community and collaborate. IFG, how movies get made.